Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Katie Schaefer. Today we're talking all about the 2006 movie Desperation. It was directed by Mick Garris, who we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. Katie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I just finished watching Desperation, so I have, some stuff to say about it. It wasn't the most riveting King film, but it's still pretty interesting.
I think the thing is, Desperation wasn't necessarily one of my favorite books of his. I think it's very interesting what he did with Desperation and the Regulators, but it just wasn't necessarily for me.
Yes, I agree with that. It had a very definite audience, and I probably was not part of that audience.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that it's such a bizarre story, it's just the way it's told and the way it ties into the Regulators. And then the fact that we don't have a Regulators adaptation to kind of go with this feels a little weird too.
Yeah, do you think that they just didn't do it? Was it never in the plans, or was it that this one didn't do well enough and so they were like, let's not?
Well, some fun facts. This was actually supposed to come out on New Line with a $33 million budget, but then Scream kind of blew up and took over, and they put the brakes on that, and it ended up being resurrected for TV as a TV movie, and the budget got cut to $12 million. That's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, and you can really tell. I mean, I would guess that some of this cast was attached before that happened, like, Tom Skerritt, Ron Perlman, because I don't know how they got Ron Perlman. I guess this was pretty early in his career, but still.
Yeah, and obviously much later in Tom Skerritt's career, because I just watched Alien for the first time, and one of my first notes was, how is this guy in both of these things?
Yeah, it is very much that. I agree.
And Steven Weber obviously had worked with Mick Garris previously on The Shining, and he's actually also going to be in one of the episodes of Nightmares and Dreamscapes.
Oh, excellent. I'm excited. I like Steven Weber. I think he's a really fun actor. I mean, he's not Tom Hardy or something, but he gives a great performance. He goes all in on it. And I think particularly in this movie, he shows more of a range than in, say, The Shining.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then you also have Annabeth Gish, who is a familiar name by now to a lot of people. Matt Frewer, who is in pretty much all of the Mick Garris adaptations in one way or another, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, I always love to see him because he also gives this one was a very restrained Matt Frewer performance, honestly, but I still really enjoyed it.
He's never really meant to be a main character in any of the adaptations he's appeared in, and I think that's what makes him interesting. He's always playing these sort of bit roles, and they vary so much. Like, this role is absolutely nothing like Trash Can Man.
Right, exactly. That's, I think, what everybody thinks of when you think of Matt Frewer in a Stephen King movie, is either that or, I mean, I guess he's in Lawnmower Man, and I guess that's technically a Stephen King adaptation, but just barely.
Barely, because he did sue them to take his name off of the movies.
Right. He was like, not mine. Don't want this. Which was really saying something for Stephen King.
Yeah, exactly. And as far as the story goes, it doesn't really live up to the casting.
No. And I think that was part of our complaint with the book, too. I seem to remember it felt like the book was really, really overly written for the story that it was presenting, because it was I could see how they didn't need to make this into a miniseries, even though it's, a brick, essentially.
Yeah. It was supposed to be like a 2-night event, too, and they boiled it down to a movie instead, which is probably better because, for the most part, a lot of the miniseries that are 2 or 3 nights tend to be, 2 hours each night. So this would have been 3 hours instead of 2 and change.
Yeah, and I don't know what they would have done in the meantime. What else would they have added to this? I don't think that there's anything they really missed out on in making this one. Like, all the big plot points get hit. Everything wraps up pretty nicely. It doesn't feel slow at any point, which it definitely does in the book. And I think they even added a little bit more story in regards to the Chinese workers, because I don't remember that part in the book. Could just be not remembering. But what would they have put in here to make it longer?
Yeah, I don't know. And I actually felt like this was a slow burn, not in a good way necessarily, because I am a huge fan of shows that are slow burns, like Better Call Saul, for instance. I absolutely love that show. It doesn't necessarily move the plot ahead very much each episode, but by the time you get to the end of a season, the payoff is more than worth it. And I felt like with this movie being over 2 hours long, I didn't really feel like the payoff at the end was worth it.
No. Oh, no. The payoff is definitely not worth it. Like with the book and the story in general, it's just a very plotting, but as in P-L-O-D-D, not P-L-O-T-T. I think in some ways it works for the story, but the story is, again, if it's not your thing, then it's not really going to work for you personally.
Yeah, and I think Mick Garris is someone who obviously has a passion for the horror genre and specifically Stephen King works. You know, I've talked about him with you in particular quite a few times on here, and I just recently did an episode on Riding the Bullet. So he has done a wide variety of different kinds of Stephen King adaptations, and it's not that I thought this was poorly made by any means. The production quality is always pretty good when it comes to Mick Garris adaptations. It's just more so the stories that he chooses to adapt, I think. And obviously, The Stand, while not a perfect adaptation, I think is definitely one of the better ones from Mick Garris. And I think it's just because there's so much to work with in that story that even if you don't get everything, you can still tell a really good story.
Yeah, and I think with The Stand, they had a decent budget to work with. Like you said, this one was so small. And it was weird because this was made in 2006, and it feels like it is straight out of 1998. Like there are about 20 or 30 Dutch angle shots where the camera is like offset and off kilter at an angle. And that's such a 90s thing to do. And the whole beginning of the movie is like that. And I was like, no, you get one of these, maybe two. But he just uses it over and over again. And the palette he uses, and it kind of feels like this is recorded with a pretty low budget camera. So it just has this 90s feel regardless of it being in the 2000s, especially with that Lord of the Rings reference that gets dropped, which was odd. So it just felt like a very interesting mix. And I think part of that was because Mick Garris directed this and he did so many of the 90s TV adaptations that we've seen. So I don't know if that really helped it because it just feels kind of cheesy at times with how it's done.
And you get a sense that a lot of the money probably went to the cast. I'm sure there wasn't anyone making, millions off of this TV movie, but they probably would have had to get paid a decent amount. And I know there are plenty of actors out there who will do certain types of movies for less money because obviously they're aware there isn't as much money in TV movies, especially of the horror variety at times. And what I think I found the most enjoyable about this was the fact that Mick Garris really does try to give you all of those perfectly creepy elements. You have the tarantulas, the scorpions, the snakes, and, Annabeth Gish in the room with all of them. And they can't hurt her, but it's still one of those things where you're like, I would not want to be in this position. And then you have the gore effects, which I think is something that when a movie gets right, it can really up your enjoyment of it. Because if the gore effects look terrible, it's just kind of like, oh, this is the budget you were working with. But with this, I felt like they were actually pretty good. Like when the boy's mom has basically been taken over by TAC and her arm comes off. And when she gets punched in the face, I was like, oh, yes, this is what I'm here for, clearly.
Yeah, well, I looked it up because I agree. The makeup effects in this are pretty fantastic, especially considering. And the reason for that is because Howard Berger is the guy who did the makeup effects for this. And he is an Oscar winner for his makeup. And his last big one that he did was Alita Battle Angel. But he is also the makeup effects supervisor for it looks like quite a long history of Tarantino's movies. Like we are going back to the 90s and he was doing all of Tarantino's makeup. Yep, Pulp Fiction. So even in the very beginning, this is a guy, and he was part of Evil Dead 2, Creep Show 2. a couple of the Nightmare on Elm Streets, Halloween. So
he knows his way around gore effects.
yeah. So this is a guy who I think that was probably one of the best choices they made, was to bring that in, because if there had been bad gore effects, it would have become laughable. It would have really veered into like Maximum Overdrive cheese territory, instead of still feeling like this is definitely a horror movie. It's not. It might be a B movie, but it's still a straight horror film.
Yeah. And again, I can tell that Mick Garris has a passion for this genre. And I listened to his podcast Postmortem, which I'll put a link to in the show notes for anyone who hasn't listened to it. But when you listen to him talk about horror, and in particular the stuff that he's had a chance to work on, he's just like happy to be here. And I love that, even if the movies aren't necessarily my favorite adaptations, because when it comes to a lot of his stuff, we've said most of it's been on TV, if not almost all of it. And a TV movie can't really compete with Stanley Kubrick, And that's not Mick's fault.
No. And I think he does a great job with what he's given. He can still make even like what is a very oft maligned adaptation of The Shining. He can still make it work. He can still make it scary, and he can still weave together a story that makes makes sense. Like it doesn't kind of leave loose ends laying around. It uses like the concept of the tack character is kind of hard to get across, and it takes the book so long. Like there's probably 150 pages devoted just to kind of giving us an idea of who and what this character is. And Mick Garris does it with that flashback for the majority of the part, where it shows being in the mine, and it does it with that weird old-timey silent movie effect. And with that, it gives it all to us with very little dialogue, and it just shows us these things, and we know what's going on without having to parse through like all these little hints and clues like the book drops throughout it.
Yeah, so to give the gist of what this story is all about is, basically these people are driving on this sort of deserted highway through Nevada, and Ron Perlman, who plays Collie
Entragian, I think is how it's pronounced.
Entragian. There we go. I was like, I think I'm missing a letter there. So thank you. And he just keeps pulling people over and suddenly finds all of this weed on them, whether it's the couple in the car traveling from Oregon, which gives us a Henry Thomas appearance, who is another cast member who has done tons of horror stuff. He pops up in a bunch of Mike Flanagan stuff specifically now. So that was just a fun little thing. And, there's a bag of weed in the trunk, and then all of a sudden it's in the side bag of Johnny Marinville's motorcycle, which definitely was not there before. And you could tell it's the same bag because it has the little smiley face or whatever on it. And before any of that even happens, off screen, an entire family is taken from their RV. And I thought we got more of that story in the book, and maybe it was just cut for time or something for the movie, because this did get off to a slow start. And I feel like it's hard when you have a setting that is just empty road.
Yes, it definitely feels boring. It's very dull, and it doesn't... And I'm sure this is a budget thing. It doesn't use the scenery to increase the desolate feel of it. It tries, but it never really quite gets there. Like, we should have a few more like vista shots and see how remote this place is.
Yeah, it just felt like they didn't really necessarily use the setting as well as they could have to sort of not necessarily fill the time, but just give you a better picture of where exactly they were, because you have this big rig go by when Steve Ames, played by Steven Weber, stops and he picks up Cynthia Smith. And it's kind of like, okay, could we get like a shot of where he pulled into or something and just get a feel like maybe people are looking out because not too many people stop by or something. And you never really get that. Instead, the truck goes blaring by and Cynthia yells something at the truck. And then it's like, okay, I guess they're on their way now.
Right. Yeah. That we don't get a lot of time to develop, or, well, it doesn't use the time it has to develop the characters a little more and the setting, because the setting in the book is very overwhelming. There's a lot of time spent given to
it's more fleshed out.
Yeah, how empty this town is. And, you know, like I said, I'm sure this is a budget thing, like setting up those shots and, you know, set dressing a whole town and all of that. That's a lot of money. So I can forgive it. And they do make an effort to try, but it just kind of falls flat. And it doesn't give the film the atmosphere that it really needs to contribute to it being more scary than it turns out.
Yeah, I will say my favorite set piece is by far the theater.
They captured that scene perfectly.
Right. It definitely felt like an old-timey theater that you would find in a town as small as that. It's like, you know, there's basically 1 or 2 rooms in that theater.
Yep. There's the backstage area, the theater area, and then like the working area. I have a theater like that here that I've been to, and it feels the exact same, where, you know, the screen rolls down and stuff for every showing of the movies. And like when that started, I was like, have I seen this movie before? And then I realized, no, this is exactly what I pictured in my head when they get in there.
And I love when the marquee says starring Johnny Marinville, you know, that was just a fun little touch, and it really let them show off the outside of the set piece as well.
Right. And I'm sure Mick was like, we are not wasting this. We got this great set where we got to get at least one of these. And they have that awesome poster of like the Viet Cong thing that references Johnny's time in Vietnam. And all of those flashback scenes are very well done. I think I liked that, and he does take that opportunity to give us more perspective on that character. So yeah, it's continuing to say, Mick Garris does his best.
He's someone who is certainly very faithful to the source material. And while I don't always think that's necessarily the best thing for an adaptation, I understand why he does the adaptations the way he does them.
And the screenplay was written by King for this one.
Which helps.
Yes. And
or not, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, and it feels like the two of them, because I think he's done that quite a few times for his movies. When the two of them work together, it feels like they can do a lot with a little bit of money. Now, anyway, King has learned how to write a screenplay, so it works a lot better now than it did, you know, Maximum Overdrive era.
Well, that he also directed, so I think that was the issue more so with that one than the screenplay. I mean, the screenplay was wonky, don't get me wrong, but...
The cocaine directed Maximum Overdrive.
Yes, it sure did. With Desperation, though, despite having these visual elements that did end up looking pretty good, it just fell so flat with the payoff at the end. And I think, you know, this happens a bit in the book too, but because you know you have the regulators either before or after this, depending on which order you decide to read them in, since they came out on the same day, that gives you a whole different look at the story of Tack in particular. And the one thing I did like about that ending, though, was when the face shows up in the smoke.
Yes, that does work really well to kind of provide that closure at the end of it.
Yeah, it gives you like this creepy, demonic look at the character.
Right, and it makes Tack feel like his own character or its own character, because throughout this, since it's just jumping bodies, it's pretty hard for the film to make it seem like this is one unified character instead of something that's with its own personality, instead of something that's just kind of possessing bodies and using them for bad, and like turning them the bad version of themselves is kind of how it feels. And then once we get that, it feels more coherent.
Yeah. What did you think of the daughter, Pi, who was dead basically from the start? She was David's sister. And I think David does a really nice job sort of being the brave kid in this. But then with Pi, it was kind of like things felt, I don't know, just a little off with the way her character would come and go.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel like a little girl or a character. It feels like it's the story moving things along, because we don't get any development of the character. And even in like flashback scenes, we don't see how she and David interact, which we get a lot of in the book. So it felt kind of like the girl character in Kingdom Hospital almost.
Yeah.
It's like you're just a foil for the story to move along.
It would have helped a lot, I think, if we got one scene of them in the RV together as a family.
Yes. Like them getting even just a scene of them, like when the spikes are across the road and we see them go over the spikes and just the two kids having their reaction. And then we see the cop car coming. That was all we would have needed. Just like 2 minutes maybe to give us a little bit of how the two of them connect.
And again, maybe that's something that they did have, but it got cut for time.
Right. Exactly. No telling what was in there now.
Yeah, because I imagine this aired in like a 3-hour block with the movie runtime coming to just over 2 hours.
Yeah, that's probably about as the commercial times then.
Yeah, and it just felt like there were a few pieces of this that if they would have tweaked them slightly, I think this would have been not necessarily a significantly better movie, but it would have been better for sure.
Yeah, exactly. If they just a little bit of tweaking really could have amped it up a little bit, even with the low production values and limited budget.
Yeah, because like you said, Mick Garris is a person who seems to know how to do a lot with a little. And that can certainly help, especially, I imagine even though we've had big hit horror movies like Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Scream, so on and so forth, it seems like there isn't nearly as much money put into the genre still.
Yeah, definitely. Even from, folks like Blumhouse, like they are on top right now for spending a little bit of money to run through as many horror films as they can in between releasing their more, not quite prestige, but as close as they get to making prestige style films.
Yeah, and that's a bummer because I would really love to see like a big budget horror movie and see what someone would be able to do with that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I love a bunch of the horror movies I have watched over especially the last few years, and I don't think you necessarily need a big budget for the genre, but it would be nice to see what would be possible.
Right, and taking a risk, doing something new and unique, or if you're going to adapt a Stephen King book with it like they did with it, I would choose a more, because I mean, it had a pretty decent budget. It was what, like 80 million? Something like that, 70 million?
That sounds about right, but I am not 100% sure. I know Dr. Sleep was between the 45 and 55 range.
Right, and that one was fantastically good. And they took risks and did something different and something that I don't know that everyone would have worked, which isn't that? Is that that's Mike Flanagan, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it worked so well, and I would love to see something done like that with even more of a budget, and you could do something much more fantastical, like not Tommyknockers, but a Tommyknockers like size story or Needful Things or something like that, where there's all these different pieces going on, and to have those big budget special effects and the big cast would really elevate the story to a whole nother level.
The first It movie was a budget of $35 million, and I imagine that's because it was all the kids, so they didn't have to pay nearly as much, because then in part 2, you have twice as many cast members.
Right, and you have, James McAvoy and Bill Hader and Jessica Chastain, who are all, not cheap actors. They are not Tom Skerritt money. They are big money.
Yeah, because the budget for that one was $79 million, so it was more than doubled from the first movie.
And the special effects in that one are a lot more. There's a lot more of them and a lot more fantastic.
Yeah, because they had to age down some of the kids, too, because they grew up too fast in between movies.
Right? I'm sure we'll see some of that with the new Stranger Things season, too.
Yeah, we'll see on that one. But I don't know if I have too much more to say about Desperation. I thought it was okay. I gave it a 2 out of 5, but it didn't really grab my attention the way I was hoping maybe an on-screen adaptation would with this.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm willing to say this. I would say that's about where I'm at, a 2 out of 5. I think it had a lot of potential. Like, I think if we had seen a feature release, like an R-rated feature release, it would have been much more interesting. But because this has to air on TV, because they had the limited budget, because, it just never really rises to the level that it could have, because it is a very, very brutal story, and there's lots of opportunity to exploit that for scares. but because it never does, it's just kind of like, okay, this is watchable. I can put it on while, I was building my son a dresser while I'm watching it, and don't feel like I missed anything while I'm doing that. But, I would be happy to watch another one, and it's certainly better than something like The Golden Years or Tommyknockers, but it's not the biggest compliment, I will say that.
Yeah, sometimes it's just tough with the stuff that's made for TV because they're limited in what they can do automatically by it being made for TV during this time period.
Exactly. It's not like it is now where TV shows, even something that's on network television can have a huge budget, like Better Call Saul or something. Well, that's on A&E, but that's basically a regular TV channel now.
Yeah, AMC, I think you meant.
Yes, AMC. Thank you.
Networks like AMC and FX are definitely pushing the limits to what you can air on actual TV, whereas, something like HBO, you have free reign pretty much.
Right. We can get Watchmen, which has, Dong for Days, just for days on it, which it allows them to show a lot more graphic violence and a lot more of just everything. But the production value quality has gone up so significantly for TV movies and TV shows that it's like the new Stand that's coming out. I can't remember who's doing that, which production company is doing it, but
it's CBS All Access where it's going to be airing. And then, it's one of those things where Mick Garris did the Stand TV adaptation, and you still got shots that had the boom mic in it. So,
yes,
those
right.
things don't happen now because one, there's much easier ways to take it out in post-production if it does happen.
But there was that shot in The Mandalorian last week's episode where you saw the crew member just peeking out just a little bit.
Yeah, I did see that after the fact. I didn't catch it in the moment I was watching it. But when people point that out, it's like, oh, okay. So clearly someone was so focused on what was happening, they didn't pay attention to the background.
Yep. And so that stuff happens. It's just not as egregious, as it was in the 90s, where it was like, all right, we're getting this out. We're doing it. No time for editing, and go.
Yeah.
And if they would catch it, they would just be like, well, I don't have another version of this shot, so this is the shot we're using.
Yeah, or like in the 80s in Cujo, where a hand comes up and grabs the dog and pulls the dog down.
Yes. There was a really great moment in this that I just laughed and I had to rewind it. The scene where there's the cougar in the bathroom that's attacking Tom Billingsley, is that his name, I think? The old man who's gone in to get the drink or whatever, and the cougar jumps in, and they just keep using the same 3 or 4 cougar sounds over and over again. And then there's a scene where you see the cougar come running up, and then it cuts to Steven Weber, and you see this obviously fake cougar arm come out and very gently pat him on the side, and he just goes sprawling. It's like, oh, that was the point. I just couldn't stop laughing. I had to text my husband, oh, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, there are definitely things like that still happening in the mid-2000s, so...
Oh, yes. And it makes it a little more fun when we're watching it for something like this. It's like, oh, there's something good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Katie, I don't have anything else to say about this. It sounds like, we're in agreement once again on how these movies sort of play out, but thank you for joining me to talk about this one.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm sure I'll be back soon for Lacey's story. It is next?
Yes.
Excellent.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.